Alrighty guys, a very warm welcome to another video. So today's video is nothing exciting, but it is some important information for anyone taking medications and also doing exercise, or even just in general, but particularly endurance exercise and particularly in the heat. Now in Australia, things are starting to obviously heat up. We're into summer now, in the thick of summer, and this is more of a risk than ever. Other parts of the world, obviously, like in the US, in Europe, or higher up in Europe, it's not going to be so much of an issue right now at this time of the year. However, depending on where you are, or even if you have a race or an Ironman race coming up in a particularly hot area or whatnot, you really want to be careful with heat stroke in general, but particularly if you're someone who takes medications. So just as a disclaimer, obviously none of this is medical advice, and if you are taking any of these medications or even other medications in general, because there's a lot more than just these 5 or 6 listed here, do consult your doctor about your individual risk for heat stroke, because different medications can compound and add to the effect of others, and complicate things, if that makes sense. So you need to assess your individual risk of heat stroke depending on your age, depending on what you take, and many other things. This is a general guide and generally some educational information only. So when it comes to racing, particularly endurance racing, something like an Ironman Triathlon, where you're going to be out there for 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, up to 16 hours, if you're racing in any temperatures that are above 20 degrees Celsius even, depending on your individual genetic factors, will determine how well you tolerate heat for starters. But particularly up into the mid-20s, 30s, mid-30s, and then, obviously up beyond that, we're getting pretty hot, and you can convert that to Fahrenheit, but here in Australia, I won't be. So you need to be very careful if you're taking any medications, but particularly these, because these are renowned for causing heat issues or heat distress. So number one is antidepressant medications. Now, these are our selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. These are our selective serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. Even some of the anti-anxiety medications like benzodiazepines, for example, and some other ones can cause an increase in sweating. Now, particularly the SSRIs, I'm not sure with the benzodiazepines exactly, but they can be a heat stroke risk. But the SSRIs and SNRIs, so this is like things like ZOLOFT or PROZAC, duloxetine. You need to figure out what you're on. If you're on an antidepressant or psychiatric medication, these can increase sweating. Why do they do that? Well, it's because of their effect on the hypothalamus and its ability to regulate temperature in the brain, which is affected by serotonin. So you increase serotonin in the brain, and also norepinephrine in some cases with SNRIs. You're going to increase the sweating or the body's output of sweat at a baseline level. And particularly when you start exercising in particularly hot conditions, etc., you're going to be sweating a lot more than you otherwise, or a little bit more than you otherwise would be if you weren't on the medication. So that can increase the risk of dehydration and increase the risk of heat stroke. They can also increase your body temperature, or the body's ability to perceive it, the brain's ability to perceive its body temperature somewhat through that serotonin mechanism. So do be very careful if you're on any of those antidepressant medications with looking out for heat stroke and taking extra precautions in the heat. The second one on the list there is beta blockers. So these are things like metoprolol, I can't even say that, PROPRANOLOL, ATENOLOL, all of the medications which are beta blockers, which essentially work to reduce blood pressure somewhat, but mainly to reduce the heart rate and the effect of adrenaline on the body, or the sympathetic nervous system, and that effect on the body. So a consequence of that is that you're going to have a decrease in sweating. This is compounded with their capacity to reduce the blood pressure somewhat. So that can increase even the risk of fainting. So if you're going to, have decreased sweating, then you can't cool down as much, increase body temperature, decrease blood pressure. Obviously, that's a bad combination for the heat. And it's not, like anything, it's not to say that you can't perform well in the heat on these and do it safely. You just need to be making sure you're aware of this increased risk. So beta blockers will decrease sweating and can increase the likelihood of you overheating because you can't cool down as well. Number 3 is stimulant-based medications. So these are more so in the realm of things like ADHD medications or attention deficit disorder, so ADDERALL, RITALIN, etc. Now, stimulant medications will increase the baseline body temperature generally, because they have that effect on the sympathetic nervous system, increasing adrenaline or norepinephrine, which does help us to focus, but it also has that stimulant-based effect. So they'll increase body temperature. A consequence of that as well will be an increase in sweating, increase in heart rate. So you want to be very careful with the stimulant-based medications that are prescription, but also things which are non-prescription. For example, over-the-counter decongestants like pseudoephedrine. Now, this is a wider banned medication. So are the ADHD ones, so you need a therapeutic use exemption to erase on them if you're worried about that. But things like pseudoephedrine, or the other one, phenylalanine, or phenylamine, or whatever the other non-prescription, just off-the-shelf decongestant is. These can constrict the blood vessels, increase the body temperature generally. So you want to be very, very careful with any stimulant-based medication. Even things like caffeine and nicotine that you take on a regular basis. You might want to just be careful with your caffeine intake or your nicotine intake. You're probably not going to be smoking a cigarette during a race, but particularly caffeine, and not overdoing it if it's very, very warm, because that can increase body temperature and sweating and increase your risk of heat stroke too. Number 4 is diuretics. Now, this isn't necessarily going to increase sweating or body temperature directly, but it can increase your risk of dehydration, because essentially the effect of a diuretic is to generally flush out sodium and water or fluid from the body to reduce the burden of fluid in the body, reduce the total, get the blood pressure down by reducing the volume of blood plasma in the body. So diuretics can be a risk factor for dehydration, because they kind of put you in a state of mild dehydration, and that's not particularly accurate, but as a baseline, they increase your baseline level of water excretion, and therefore can increase your dehydration risk when you compound this with increased sweating, etc. So do be very careful racing on diuretics if they're prescribed to you and you need them for blood pressure regulation or your heart or whatever. Diuretics will be one thing that can cause problems in the heat. The next one are antihistamines. Now, this is even just over-the-counter antihistamines. For example, like Benadryl, the allergy-based medications. These can decrease sweating. They have an anticholinergic effect. Doesn't really matter so much, what that actually means. But the essence of it is that they decrease sweating as well. So again, when you decrease sweating, it's just going to increase your risk of overheating, and therefore increase the rate at which your body will increase its body temperature in the heat whilst exercising, because you can't cool down as well. And, obviously, therefore, you have an increased risk of heat stroke. So there's 5 that will directly increase your risk of heat stroke via different mechanisms: increased sweating, decreased sweating, increased body temperature, or dehydration. All of these things can cause increases of body temperature, or reduced ability to regulate temperature, or just reduced blood plasma volume, which is caused by, obviously, a consequence of dehydration, and something you really want to be careful with. I've noted there as well, just as another, side point, is that antibiotics, you want to be real careful with antibiotics if you're racing in the heat, but also if you're racing or you're out in the sun. So antibiotics generally, and different variants of or types of antibiotics will increase this to different extents, but they'll increase photosensitivity. Now, what does that mean? It increases the sensitivity of your skin to the sunlight. So you'll burn at a much faster rate than you otherwise would if you weren't taking some of these particular antibiotics. So you want to be very, very careful with sun protection, sunblock, or just covering up generally if you can, and you're on antibiotics. Obviously, if you're on antibiotics, maybe you shouldn't be racing anyway. But just be very careful if you're out in the sun on antibiotics, because that can increase photosensitivity, increase the risk of sunburn, which is a whole nother thing in and of itself, but also increase body temperature and risk of heat stroke in the process. But that's just a side. These 5 are very common medications which many people take on a daily basis, and they can be a real, medical risk factor or a medical a consideration you really want to be making with respect to your overall health and your risk of heat stroke, because the last thing you want to be doing is putting your health in a compromised state because of medications that you're otherwise prescribed or just taking over the counter. Like I said before, this isn't medical advice, so do consult your doctor for any specific concerns with your medications. And as well, this isn't by no means at all a comprehensive list. There are many more medications that you need to be aware of as well, but these are just some very common medications, in my opinion, that are probably the top 5 you want to be aware of, and that likely a lot of people, or a majority of people, if they were to be taking medications, would probably be on some of these. So just be aware of that. Hopefully that was some not very exciting information, but useful information for you guys with respect to caring for your overall health. Post any questions below. Take care, guys. Safe training. Happy holidays, and I will see everyone in the next video.